Is the judiciary in a crisis? Who should judge our judges? Who should be our next Chief Justice? And did the JSC even follow the correct process when they recommended one candidate to President Cyril Ramaphosa? Those are some of the questions that we will explore this afternoon in our latest edition of Frontline here on News 24. Welcome to the session. My name is Adriaan Basson. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of News 24. And it is a great privilege and honor to welcome today on our panel with me, Nicole Fritz, the Executive Director of the Helen Suzman Foundation in Johannesburg. Also, I have Lawson Naidoo, the Executive Secretary of Casac, the Council for the Advancement of Our Constitution, and News 24's own legal specialist, legal hack, Karyn Maughan, who's had the best 2 weeks of her life. Karyn, you can't believe that the legal news has made headlines for so long. Karyn, I can't hear you at the moment. You may be on mute. No, still can't hear Karyn, so I'm going to try a bit later again. Colleagues, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon in this panel. Certainly has been a few busy days since the announcement on, when was it? Was it Saturday or Sunday by the JSC that the Supreme Court of Appeal President, Judge Mandisa Maya, is recommended by the Judicial Service Commission as South Africa's next Chief Justice to President Ramaphosa. At the time, and Karyn specifically pushed Dali Mpofu, the spokesperson for the JSC, they had not yet recommended that in writing to President Ramaphosa. It's unclear if that has happened by today. But let's just start with some of the latest news that we've been covering at News 24 over the past 48 hours. Nicole Fritz, if I can start with you, there's been a lot said over the past 48 hours on the suitability of certain commissioners of the JSC, and then mainly Dali Mpofu, the advocate, the senior advocate who represents the General Counsel of the Bar as one of the two members of the advocate's profession on the JSC. The latest statement to drop this morning was from the Black Lawyers Association. If I can just briefly read from it, the Black Lawyers Association, the BLA, welcomes the nomination of President Maya for this position. But then they continue, we are, however, of the view that the process of the interviews was mired in disrespect for certain candidates, an absolute lack of decorum. The denigrating and humiliation of certain candidates who have availed themselves of the opportunity to serve the country did not leave the JSC process unquestionable. It also raised pertinent questions about the behavior of certain commissioners who have seemed to have forgotten that they ought to be a reflection of the best that South Africa and South Africans can be. That is the BLA this morning, and that, Nicole, follows the statements by the Pretoria Bar Council last night, as well as the General Counsel of the Bar last night. First one was the Pretoria Bar Council, who has asked last night for the recusal of Dali Mpofu as representative of the advocates' body on the JSC. The General Counsel of the Bar didn't quite go that far, but they have said that he has brought the advocates' profession into disrespect for his behavior at this round of interviews, and they will now be engaging with the Advocates for Transformation organization that has a 50% representation, is my understanding, on the General Counsel of the Bar. Nicole, is this a bit of a sideshow? Is this not? How important is this discussion around decorum and the behavior of specifically Mpofu and his line of questioning, specifically then to Judge President Dunstan Mlambo from Gauteng? Is it a sideshow? How important is this, or is it central to this discussion today?
Thanks, Adriaan, and good afternoon to those joining. I think it's absolutely central. It's not a sideshow, and I think what is important to keep in mind is that we do potentially have this unprecedented, historic announcement of the recommendation of Judge Mandisa Maya to be the next Chief Justice. That's a recommendation emanating from the Judicial Service Commission. We can discuss later whether it is proper. That was a proper exercise of the JSC's function in this exercise. But many of us are only too acutely aware that were Judge Mandisa Maya to be appointed the next Chief Justice, that would be a historic development in our country's history. We've never before had a female Chief Justice. But I think what is happening is that the protest and opposition at the shameful conduct of the interviews, which we saw play out last week, is being unscrupulously represented by certain parties to be in opposition to the recommendation of Justice Meyer. And that really is not the case. The fact is, if this process is to be taken into account in terms of the appointment of the next Chief Justice, that person, whether it be Justice Meyer, is essentially handed a poisoned chalice, that the beginning of their tenure would always be tainted by a process that was so degraded and corrupted, that saw such flagrant abuse of several of the JSC commissioners in respect of their powers and roles. And so I think it's important that we keep in mind that there are two issues here. One, this recommendation, but two, this process that underlies it, which was so, as I've said, corrupted and debased.
Thank you, Nicole. Lawson, if I can just start by asking your views on these latest developments and their importance or not in this discussion.
Thanks, Adriaan. Look, I think they are important, and I think the statements that have emanated from the GCB as well as from the Black Lawyers Association are very important, because they reflect not just they reflect the views of the legal profession on the conduct and the lack of decorum that pervaded the interviews that were held last week. But I want to also point out that you will recall, Adriaan, that Casac went to court last year to challenge a similar JSC process in April last year, when candidates were being interviewed for vacancies in the Constitutional Court, and once again descended into political attacks, into unfair attacks on particular candidates. And one would have hoped that that litigation, although it was settled in an out-of-court settlement, would have given an indication to the JSC about its future conduct. But it seems that those lessons have not been heeded or learned, and we saw a repeat of that in many respects last week. But I think, and that certainly, as Nicole says, unfortunately, taints the nomination of a highly deserving candidate in Judge Mandisa Meyer, whose credentials speak for themselves. And the JSC has actually done her a great disservice in the manner in which it conducted the process, because it undermines her nomination now. And that should not be so. She deserves so much better. And they have let her down. And as you've said, they've let the country down.
Karyn Maughan, I hope you can hear me well, and I hope that we will be able to hear you, because I really want to hear your views. You've been covering JSC hearings for many years, and obviously there is a level of robustness that one expects when you choose the country's new Chief Justice. We were all, this week, I saw one of the most popular videos being recirculated was former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneki's questioning of the former Chief Justice Mogoeng during that round of interviews. And the question by certain people then asked, well, why do people like myself and you take issue now with the way that Dali Mpofu and others questioned Dunstan Lambo? At what point during the interviews last week, while you were sitting there, at what point did it degenerate from robust, hard-hitting, thick-skinned, to use Dali Mpofu's word, interviews into denigration, humiliation, and even defamation?
I think one of the problems that emerged was when Dali Mpofu made what has been described as sort of a schoolboy, sexual innuendo. And right at the beginning of his questioning of Judge President Meyer, where he said, we spent the night together in reference to an all-night study session. Now, he's come out and said this was a joke and no one should take this seriously and he's being unfairly undermined. But it really showed in that moment the kind of patronizing tone that was adopted towards her in a sexist and misogynistic way. That meant that she wasn't, the tough questions were not put to her She was given what many have described as a sweetheart interview, and she made it clear from the onset that she believed that she was the right person, not woman, to lead the judiciary, and that she could take on those questions, which were not asked of her. So that was when the wheels first started, falling off. And I think even in Madlanga's questioning, Vuyiseli Madlanga, where a number of questions were put to him, which were clearly a precursor to, the Zondo bashing session that we saw at the end of the week. But there is a crucial difference, Adriaan, between what happened with the CJ nominee, Mogoeng, and what happened with Dunstan and Mlambo. Mogoeng was asked about 3 judgments that he'd given in respect of rape matters, where he had, in certain instances, reduced sentences on the basis that the rape was not, quote unquote, as severe, or was, there was certain language that he used. And he was questioned about judgments that he gave, on record judgments, and asked, what informed this? What was the rationale behind it? He was certainly not put in a position where someone said to him, oh, well, there's a rumor, for example, that, you are sexually inappropriate with people, or that you beat your wife, or something equally damaging in a country, any country, but especially a country as riven by gender-based violence as we are, with no complaint being lodged, with no sense of where this accusation comes out of, and with Mlambo later making it very clear that these rumors had started to emerge at the exact time when, he was considered a nominee for the Chief Justice position. So there's a vast world of difference. And I think that for people to try and suggest that what happened with Mogoeng, which was robust, but always respectful, and what happened with Mlambo, which was based on insinuation, was essentially asking this person to shoot in the dark at allegations that seem to have no substantive basis. I think that is a blatantly false comparison, and I think it must be rejected out of hand.
Nicole, Dali Mpofu has defended his comments. My understanding is, as late as this morning on a radio interview, he's defended him raising these rumors of sexual harassment against Dunstan Mlambo. And he said during the interviews, if I recall correctly, that he wants to give Mlambo an opportunity to clear the air about these rumors. And Mlambo acknowledged that he was aware of these rumors. I have some strong views which I have expressed over the past few days about this, but I would like to hear your views on why you think it was an inappropriate line of questioning.
Well, Adriaan, I thought that you did put it very powerfully in your piece that you authored earlier this week. You and many of us will have heard many rumors about Mr. Mpofu. You might dearly love to publish them. It would be entirely improper for you to do so, and you recognize that. I think what makes it particularly gross in this instance is that Mr. Mpofu is a seasoned senior advocate, and he knows that if he were interacting with a witness on a witness stand, it would be entirely improper to put to that witness claims based entirely on rumor for which there is no sound basis. So the fact that he, as a legal professional, would understand that restrains his behavior, but nonetheless subjects a candidate who is being considered for elevation to the top job in our judiciary and gives him no such consideration, is prepared to engage in what was a sustained smear. So essentially that line of questioning wasn't just Mr. Mpofu's, but essentially together with Mr. Malema, that took up to around 2 hours, which represents almost half of the allocated time, what was allocated originally for the interview of Judge President Mlambo. And as I said, the fact that Mr. Mpofu would give to Judge President Mlambo none of the consideration, respect, the basic courtesy, and in fact the ethical obligation and duty that he is required to give those who he is cross-examining is shameful.
Lawson Naidoo, I guess the million-dollar question, or one of the million-dollar questions, remains: why did Dali Mpofu, of course a member and in the leadership of the EFF as well, who some would call a politician in robes, why did he and Julius Malema, why do they so terribly want to keep Dunstan Mlambo out of the Chief Justice office? And do you believe that's the case?
Sorry, I missed the last part of your question, Adriaan.
No problem. I was asking, why do you think that Dali Mpofu and Julius Malema wants to keep Mlambo out of the office of the Chief Justice so desperately, if you believe that is the case?
Well, I don't want to speculate on what their reasons might be, but it is quite clear that they were opposed to his candidacy and went out of their way to undermine his candidacy in the manner of the questions that you've just discussed with Nicole regarding the unfounded allegations of sexual harassment, which should never have been raised. And the presiding officer in the JSC, Judge Petzer, should have ruled them out of order at the beginning, rather than allowing a long discussion on the issue, and then saying that the questions and discussion must be expunged from the record. The damage had been done by then, and it was clear. It was part of a clear strategy to undermine the candidacy of Judge President Mlambo. And as I said earlier, it has brought the whole process into disrepute. But it wasn't just Mr. Mpofu or Mr. Malema. There were other members of the JSC that participated in those lines of questioning, and I think that needs to lead to a broader discussion about how the JSC functions. And I think the BLA in their statement this morning make reference to some potential reforms in the form of an adoption of a code of conduct, rules of procedure. And I think most importantly, what many of us in civil society have been asking for a very long time is clear objective criteria against which candidates are measured, so that each candidate is measured against a set of objective criteria as is done in any other HR recruitment process, which is absent from this, and it becomes highly subjective, and in this case, highly speculative as well. So I think those are the questions that we need to ask. It's also interesting in the GCB statement that you referred to earlier, Adriaan. They question Mr. Mpofu's suitability to serve on the JSC, and the question needs to be asked of the GCB: why have they not done anything about this sooner? And in a similar vein, the question needs to be asked of the JSC itself: is why they retain Mr. Mpofu as one of their two spokespeople, given the controversy that he generally attracts.
Lawson, I just want to stay on this point for a moment with you, if I may. Are we just seeing a unfortunately bad crop of JSC commissioners, or is this a systemic issue? I mean, has the JSC worked better in prior years? Are we just, I don't know, what's the opposite of blessed, unblessed, or cursed by a particularly poor crop of commissioners?
Well, I think it may well be a combination of the two, but I don't think we should dwell too much on the people who sit on the JSC at the moment. I think even if we change those people, it doesn't necessarily solve the systemic problem, which, as I say, is a lack of structure of how the JSC goes about its business. What are the criteria that candidates are measured against? So if somebody's going to put their hand up from the legal profession to become a member of the bench, they need to know what criteria they need to be able to meet in order to do that they will be judged on that criteria. There needs to be a code of conduct, as I've said, for commissioners, all of the commissioners of the JSC, so they all understand their roles. And there need to be proper rules of procedure. And I think importantly, and this is where the different kinds of sets of interviews that we've seen has depended to a large extent on the authority that is exercised by the person who is presiding over the JSC at a particular point in time. So I think if we go back to the October interviews, when that April round was redone, it was done in a much better way in October, when the then Deputy Chief Justice Zondo was presiding, and that was a marked difference. So who presides makes a difference. But if we have these rules in place, that will matter less.
Yeah. course, the outcome of that was the same as the first one. Karyn Maughan, I want us to move us forward into this predicament facing the president now. But before we go there, can you just take us into what happened, according to your sources and information, in that closed session after the public hearing? So the JSC, after the hearings on Saturday, reconvened in a closed session which the media could not attend. And that culminated in that very short press statement by Mpofu that Mandisa Maya is their recommended candidate. Can you tell us a bit about what you've heard happened in there?
Well, one of the pivotal issues, which I think is at the heart of this discussion and needs to be centered at the heart of this discussion, was that I was informed that a number of the sort of, legal experts, the academics, and some of the lawyers, not all of them, there was a very decided camp in the other direction, was raising this point of, was the JSC actually expected to make a recommendation? Given that the Constitution in Section 174(3) makes it, gives the power, the ultimate discretion to the president to choose who he wants to lead the judiciary. And remember that, he has to consult, the word is consult with the JSC, consult with, heads of political parties in parliament, but certainly he's not bound by any of those consultations until, in terms of making his appointment. So my understanding is that they spent about 2 hours discussing this issue about whether or not there should be a recommendation. And the academics and some of the lawyers were overwhelmed by the feeling by the argument made by Mpofu and others that indeed there needed to be a vote, which is bizarre, and I think we will discuss this later, given that when Concord, and it is a different process, but even when Concord nominees are made, the president is given, whatever the number of vacancies is, plus an additional 3 more. So there's all this underlying thing that the president must have a choice. And the overwhelming feeling is from certain of the people that I've spoken to was in the kind of sustained project of undermining Mlambo, who was widely regarded as Maya's most fierce competition for this position. They were attempting to use politics to achieve what they couldn't in law. So they went about a sustained kind of undermining of Mlambo in that process. And by putting forward the name of Mandisa Maya without even, any kind of written discussion with the president, any of that, they were essentially trying to force his hand, which, as I've said before, is grossly unfair to Mandisa Maya, but also grossly unfair to the South African people who were really, trusting the JSC to do a methodical, unbiased, impartial evaluation of the strengths and weaknesses of each of these candidates, and to give them to the president in a way that would enable him to make the best possible decision.
Nicole Fritz, from the Helen Suzman Foundation that you head, you guys have said that you would consider, I think, challenging this round of interviews in the court, and precisely because of this, that there were procedural mistakes. Do you agree with Karyn Maughan's analysis that the JSC is trying to force the president's hand here, and that they actually were not asked to recommend a candidate, but to do something else? And what is that something else in your view?
So I think that that's right. And in fact, I want to make my comments on the back of both Lawson and Karyn's point. What we saw in those interviews was, in fact, the Judicial Service Commission and commissioners asking the various candidates to elaborate on what they thought the JSC's role should be in terms of, consulting to the president in respect of this process, which indicated that there was no clear grasp on the part of the JSC as to what they were about. So it was kind of make it up as we go along type process, which I think speaks to what Lawson had previously indicated. That yes, I would say that there are some deeply troublesome, problematic characters within the JSC at the present time. But in order to cure this, there has to be some systematic reform. And some of that is just clearly articulated and prescribed process, so that both the commissioners and the public is confident and satisfied as to what is going to happen. And that is something that we as the public have been denied, and certainly those candidates who are presenting themselves for possible appointment are denied, and I think prejudiced by. And so what you have, I mean, I think the other point, coming from Karyn's input, which I think is really important, is to keep this in mind, right? Is that that generally with the appointment of other judges, there is a greater role that is given the JSC. So they are they interview the candidates, and then they offer a list of recommendations, 2 more than the vacancies. Than the vacancies require, so that the president has a choice, but to some extent his choice is fettered, so limited. That's not the case with the appointment of the Chief Justice, right? The Constitution gives the power to the president to make the appointment. He has a less constrained choice in terms of that appointment. He merely has to consult with the JSC and with the heads of the political parties in the National Assembly. What you see here is the Judicial Service Commission essentially constraining, limiting in a way that is not set out by the Constitution, the president's powers. So they come out with this brief announcement announcing their chosen nominees before even a report has been handed to the president about their interviews and their deliberations. And they are engaging in this exercise and exercising their powers as a consultative body to the president so that he might exercise his power of appointment. So again, I think it is highly improper that you would have this announcement, which is simply that we're recommending a single candidate, without there having, and that coming before, and long before, in fact, any report given to the president. And as I say, the powers there are in order to inform the president's exercise of his powers to appoint.
Nicole, where's your thinking at the moment around a legal challenge to the process?
Look, we are considering it, but we are being careful. We are mindful of what happened last time with, Casac's, very clear, considered challenge that ultimately resulted in settlement out of court, but a rerun of a process that saw an improved performance on the part of the commissioners, but no change in the outcome. And I think that is obviously something that is concerning. We are also mindful of the fact that it is the president's power to appoint, and that he is not bound by this process. So as I said, we are in discussion at this point in time.
Lawson, but this does put the President Ramaphosa in a curious predicament, because if he does not appoint President Maya, I mean, the feedback will obviously be things like he's anti-transformation, he's anti-women, he had a chance to do something historic and bold, which he didn't do. And if he does appoint her, he could be seen to be furthering the JSC's flawed or problematic process. I mean, knowing Ramaphosa and having followed his moves and his thinking very closely over the past few years, Lawson Naidoo, where do you think he is going to go with this? Where do you think? Well, let me ask you 2 questions. What should he do, and what do you think he will do?
Thanks. Well, let me start with Nicole's points, and to reiterate that the JSC have fettered the discretion that the Constitution confers upon the president. He's only required to consult with the JSC, similarly to consult with the leaders of political parties in the National Assembly. But I think we must go back to the beginning of this process, Adriaan. The president has initiated a very different process this time around. In the past, we've had one candidate's name put forward by the president, who was interviewed by the JSC, consulted political parties, and appointment was made. This is the first time we've had public nominations for the office of Chief Justice. We had an independent panel that screened that initial list and produced a short list, which the president then referred to the JSC. And I think it would have, with the hindsight, certainly, it would have been preferable if the president had indicated when he referred these 4 names to the JSC as to what he expected of them in the circumstances, that they should interview each of them and provide a report to him on the strengths and weaknesses of each of those candidates, and to basically provide counsel and advice to the president regarding each of those 4 shortlisted candidates, and to leave that discretion to the president. That did not happen. Now, what should the president do? So we don't know, as Karyn has said, what form that report from the JSC is going to take to the president. My understanding is that normally the head of the JSC would seek an audience with the president in order to present their findings and recommendations. It's done, I presume, both verbally and in writing. And I think the president would be at liberty, and in fact, I would should be encouraged to ask the JSC to give him a detailed report on the 4 candidates that they've interviewed, a summary of their closed session deliberations, and to leave him to then weigh up that opinion of the JSC, present that perhaps as part of his consultation process with the leaders of political parties, and then make up his mind. I agree entirely that if he were to not appoint Justice Meyer for whatever reason, he's going to come in for considerable criticism. But on the other hand, if he were to do so, I think she's, as I think we've all agreed, a candidate that has presented herself with incredible credentials, with great experience of running the second highest court in the country, the Supreme Court of Appeal, and is therefore eminently qualified and a suitable candidate to assume office as Chief Justice. So perhaps I'm not answering your question directly, because I think the president is caught between a rock and a hard place.
Karyn, can I ask you to take out your crystal ball? I think it's on that rack, the shelf there behind you, and just tell us what President Ramaphosa is going to do.
Well, I mean, he has to consult with the heads of the political parties. He has to receive a report from the JSC. As they said before, they will provide him with that report. And then he must make a decision in light of all of that, whether or not we don't know if there's going to be a legal challenge or there won't be. And ultimately, this is a legacy-making decision for him. But I think the biggest issue for me is that we have got constitutional court interviews coming up in April. And if there isn't a substantive kind of real hard look at how the JS is operating, which, the symptoms of this kind of disease that has been sitting there for so long are now starting to manifest themselves in a way that is completely impossible to ignore. We're going to sit with, the same issues being raised over and over again. And I think, one of the biggest problems for me is that, and I think that both Pierre de Force, Dan Mafora have both written like brilliant pieces, and I would urge people to read about them, but they're talking about the fact that, especially in Dan Mafora's case, that there's a pathology of operation with the JSC not really knowing what its job is, fundamentally misconstruing what its role is in terms of the appointment of the Chief Justice, way overshooting its powers, and embarking on a questioning process which was thoroughly inconsistent. As Pierre de Force points out, we had no sense of really where these judges' legal philosophy and ideology lay. They weren't questioned at any great length about judgments, unless those judgments specifically involved A, Jacob Zuma, and B, the EFF or the public protector, and so Ramaphosa, and were completely along, sort of fairly factional political lines. We don't have a sense really about these people as jurists, and that is a great problem. And what I would argue for is that we actually need to start arguing that the deliberation process of the JSC is open to the public, that what happens behind closed doors is now transparent and available for everyone to see. Because as Justice Madlanga pointed out when he ruled on HSF's application to get access to the record that informed the decision to refuse Jeremy Gauntlet, the advocate of position, on the bench. Madlanga said, and I'm paraphrasing here, this is not exactly what he said, but this is not his exact words, but he said something along the lines of, you don't say in private what you're not prepared to say in public. And I think that we now as the public need to have access to those deliberations. deliberations. We need to have access to all the documents that come before the JSC when they consider objections or support. There needs to be greater transparency, because it's becoming more and more apparent that even in its current format, but in any format, there needs to be a degree to which we can hold the JSC accountable for its conduct. And certainly in circumstances where objections are raised out of thin air with absolutely no complaint being leveled, and other substantive complaints are not ventilated, as my understanding is, in any kind of appropriate way, I think that we're fully entitled to get access to those deliberations.
Karyn, of course, President Ramaphosa does have a bit of a option available to him, a kind of an escape option for 2-3 years, by appointing one of the judges who are nearing the end of their term, and that is Acting Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, or then Constitutional Court Justice Mbuyisile Madlanga, who both have around 3 years left on the bench, and then appointing Mandisa Maya or Dunstan Mlambo. Do you think that's an option he's considering?
I think he'll consider all options. And I mean, it's important to remember that the argument around the remaining term of the judge is a bit of a damn squib, because as I think Dunstan and Mlambo pointed out, Sandile Ngcobo served less than 2 years when he was appointed DJ. So it's not really about the length of the time in office that should be the evaluation of whether or not you're a solid candidate, but it is indeed an option for him. And I think there would be a strong argument to say, particularly with Zondo and with Mlambo to some degree, that both of those judges have shown massive courage and resilience in the face of huge kind of attacks. We know Zondo is still remaining under protection because of his work as state capture inquiry. Mlambo was a very sort of a very strong judge at a time where it was really not in his judicial career interest to do so. And they represent the kind of brand of strong, outspoken leadership that the judiciary needs most now when it's under the most fierce attack. And I don't think it's coincidental that one of the strongest lines of criticism Zondo faced during that questioning process was about him coming out and actually openly taking on Tourism Minister Lindiwe Sisulu about the comparison of black judges to quote unquote house Negroes. And I think that, it's really about Ramaphosa looking at the state of the judiciary right now, looking at the fact that many of the people who most vehemently and painfully attack it on completely unsubstantiated bases happen to be on the JSC, and making a decision about whether he is going to, put someone in that position who's going to take that stuff head on. What kind of Chief Justice does he want? And ultimately knowing that whoever he chooses is going to say a lot about him and his political legacy.
Nicole, Karyn previously referred to the analysis or the takeaway that Judge Maya seemingly had what she called a sweetheart interview, a friendly interview. She was asked time and again by commissioners of being the first woman. The fact that she's a woman was emphasized over and over again. I thought the toughest question she faced, or the most probably revealing moment of her interview, was her disclosure that she perceives Western Cape Judge President John Hlophe, who's not uncontroversial at the JSC, as a big brother, and that she had recused herself from the JSC's deliberations about the future of John Hlophe and the fact whether he should face an impeachment hearing after the report by the JCC, that she recused herself because she felt she had a conflict. And if I remember her quotes quoting like Karyn did, not 100% there, but paraphrasing, she said, if I had to, for some reason, rule in his favor or vote in his favor, and it would then be revealed that I am his sister in a friendly form or very close friend, that would put me in a difficult or bad position. What did you make of her answer in this regard? And obviously that wasn't interrogated very well by the commissioners, so let's do it here. What did you make of her answer, and what would have you wanted her to elaborate on, if at all?
Well, as you say, Adriaan, Judge President John Hlophe is a very controversial figure. He has last year finally been found by the Judicial Service Commission to be guilty of gross judicial misconduct, and there was a referral to the National Assembly for it to initiate impeachment proceedings. Judge President Hlophe is in fact at present seeking a review of the decision of the Judicial Service Commission and of the decision, the underlying decision on the part of the Judicial Conduct Tribunal. I don't know that there is anything negative that one can take away from the fact that Justice Maya, has a close relationship with Judge President Hlophe. The legal community, the judicial community in this country is exceptionally small, and we saw that throughout the interview process. So there was lots of reference on the part of the chair and of various commissioners in the legal profession to their knowledge of the candidates from previous times, and this, I have to say, is an issue that has bedeviled the judiciary for some time, in that because it is so small, you've had occasions where, judges have, potentially had family members act before them, or, seen to have particularly close relationships. It was an issue, in fact, that came up in respect of former Chief Justice Mogoeng's interviews. But I think that the issue here is that, of course, if you are the leader of the judiciary, if you take the helm, you can't necessarily. You've got to make your decisions on a basis of principle, and you've got to hold the line. And it's not a case that you can just sort of recuse yourself in issues where there may be some personal discomfort. It is essentially about acting from principle. But I think the point that I want to emphasize here, Adriaan, too, is that and again, just to reiterate, I think a view that's been held by a number of us here on this webinar, is that the interview of Justice Maya did her no favors, right? Because the fact that she wasn't then sort of probed, and that a robust discussion wasn't had with her, is not of her making. That is the flaw of the interview process. And so certainly one would have wanted to hear that her answers elaborated and unpacked. And we as the public were never given that opportunity, because we did not see the type of robust engagement with her that we might have wanted, and that she certainly is equal to. And so, instead we had the commissioners going on and on about gender issues in what was, quite frankly, a fairly patronizing approach.
Lawson, just to stay on this matter of principle and potential conflicts of interest for a while, if she's appointed as Chief Justice, President Maya, as she currently is, will surely, I think without doubt, be in her term confronted by something to do with Western Cape Judge President John Hlophe. We know how long this case has been dragging for, and there's no indication that it's going to be resolved anytime soon. Whether it's John Hlophe or someone else who she's a very good friend of, maybe had studied together. As Nicole said, the Judicial Commission is quite small, and people have studied together, they article together, they some were even in the struggle together. Is it good enough for a Chief Justice to say, well, I'm not going to participate because this is someone that I know very well?
Well, look, I think the whole issue around recusal and conflicts of interest, there are no easy answers. And I think, one must accept the honest opinion of Judge Maya in this regard. If she feels that the relationship with Judge President Hlophe or anybody else that comes before her in a matter, and she feels that the relationship is of such a nature that she would not be able to bring an independent mind to bear, because the nature of that relationship is such that she recognizes that she would not be able to do justice to the office that she holds, then it would be absolutely correct for her to recuse herself, as it would for any judge in any other matter in a similar case. And recusal is a provision that is there specifically to provide for circumstances such as these. It is, as Nicole says, exacerbated in the legal profession because it is a small profession, and judges come usually from out of that legal profession of either being advocates or attorneys. and generally would know each other. So, in those circumstances, one must, one must accept the honesty of saying, I don't think I will be able to discharge my function in this matter in the manner that I would like to. And therefore, if there's a chance that I may not be able to do so, it's best in the interests of justice and of the country to recuse myself.
Karyn, did you want to add anything on the way you were there, the way that this question was handled, the way she answered, and what followed or what didn't follow?
I think the pivotal issue for me is that in Tlhope's challenge to the JSC tribunal process that he's brought, he specifically raises the fact that neither Judge Meyer nor her deputy were part of the voting body that ultimately decided that he should face impeachment by endorsing the tribunal report. And, it's very, I think that one of the questions that needed to be asked of her, which wasn't, and I mean, I'm not sure why that happened, was why, she said, look, I explained to the JSC, I said, I don't believe that it's appropriate for me in these circumstances to do this. But then I sent an alternate. Tlhope now saying the person that you sent was really just completely should not have been there. It wasn't appropriate. So I would have liked to have seen her interrogated about who she chose and whether she felt, comfortable that this was within the parameters of the law. I know that there are issues in regards to pending cases where you don't necessarily want to get, stuck into details. But given that the JSC has actually responded to this, I would have been interested to hear her response to it. The other issue, which of course we know, first emerged in April last year, was the fact that her daughter had been clerking for Justice Catherine Sedlawane at the Concourt, where there was a sort of escalation of conflict between the two of them, which resulted in Judge Meyer's daughter laying a formal complaint against Acting Justice Catherine Sedlawane at the JSC, which the JSC subsequently dismissed. And which Judge Meyer's daughter is now appealing. That was brought up, but in almost a sort of, not with any kind of great detail at all. And President Meyer simply saying, look, I'm an adult, we can deal with these conflicts going forward. But Acting Justice Catherine Sedlawane is going to again apply for that position. In April. I think if I remember correctly, President Meyer said she would potentially recuse herself, but I may be mistaken on that. But I felt like that was also an issue that needed to be addressed more substantively, because if there was a potential for Judge Catherine Sedlawane to get elevated to the Concourt bench, how could that be managed in situations where, the president's daughter is pursuing a complaint against her that was dismissed by the JSC. I think that those are the kind of issues that really do need to be fully ventilated in fairness to all concerned, because without proper answers to those kind of questions, we don't really get a sense of the kind of ethical parameters that exist within this judicial personality. And I'm sure that had been given the opportunity, she should have answered those questions. She just wasn't given the opportunity.
Nicole, I want to go back to the question that I pushed Lawson on. He didn't take the bait. I'm going to try again with you, which is this matter of why the almost concerted and loud and aggressive effort by at least Commissioners Mpofu and Malema, but surely also others, to disqualify the likes of Dansi Mlambo and Raymond Zondo. The obvious answer, or the obvious thing that's in front of us all that's not controversial, I guess, is that Judge Zondo is the person chairing probably the most important commission of inquiry in our democratic history after the TRC. Justice Mlambo, on the other hand, has been the judge in a number of extremely important, hard-hitting judgments that went against the, let me call them, Zuma/RET grouping that includes people like the EFF and Busisiwe Mkhwebane, the incumbent public protector, Justice Madlanga to a lesser extent, and Maya also. Do you think these things came into consideration Why were they so vehemently opposed to these two candidates' candidacies?
Adriaan, I think I am going to have to disappoint you again as well, and not take the bait, because I don't think that my speculation is going to be of any particular value in this forum. You know, we've seen, and it is a tragedy, right? We've seen some of the kind of spill out from these interview processes, which are fairly toxic. So you will have seen the response from some members of the bar to your piece earlier this week, and I think in this climate where it's been so polarized, and I certainly think that it is being deliberately manipulated, but I don't have the knowledge to be able to say why it's being manipulated and who are the central actors. I do think, though, that given the toxicity and the polarization, we need to be really clear about what we do agree on. And what we do agree on is that we had 4 really eminent candidates for Chief Justice. They were all let down and ill-served by this process. And the process was shambolic and an abomination. And it departed from the most basic principles of justice. And that is a shame, because what we are doing is selecting a Chief Justice who is the embodiment of justice. And so if we can't, in the selection process, even adhere to the most fundamental tenets of justice and fairness, then I think that, you know, we have to be collectively shamed and disgraced by our selection of the next Chief Justice. And I think that that's something that we can agree on, and we must agree on.
Yes, a very good, excellent point, and I think we can all agree. Karyn, I see your hand. I'm coming to you next. Nicole, I just want to finish something you've said, or to add to that. I mean, I thought back last week as we were sitting and looking at the shambolic interviews, and I thought to myself, and I agree with you, that, you know, at least we're not here. How many years ago, Karyn, when Judge Mogoeng was the only candidate for Chief Justice? I think we have progressed from those years. You know, we had 4 excellent candidates. We have 4 excellent candidates. And there's no doubt that either of them are suitable for this position, where under Jacob Zuma, a relatively obscure and unknown judge from the Northwest was catapulted into the position of Chief Justice. Karyn, did you want to add, or just want to agree with Nicole?
I just think that, you know, one of the horrible toxic pathologies that we've seen emerging, not just in these interviews, but in the JSC interviews in general, is the judges who make rulings against the EFF, who make rulings against Jacob Zuma, and I think Peter Voss writes about this as well. You know, they're being sent a message constantly that doing that is career inhibiting. I mean, when Aubrey Ledwaba was interviewed for a position at the SCA, you know, he was asked at length about the sealing of the CR17 records. There was this amazing interchange between himself and Dunstan and Mlambo, where Mlambo actually says to him, you know, we had a discussion and we talked about the fact that maybe we shouldn't take on these big cases, you know, these big political cases. But you and I both decided that we basically needed to step up to the plate. And that's what they did. And Mlambo is also, you know, in terms of the JSC Hlophe process, where there is a split, and we know from Hlophe's court papers that Dali Mpofu, Griffiths Vadansela, you know, amongst others, are very much against the prospect of Judge President Hlophe being impeached. You know, Mlambo was the person that wrote the report that said, no, these findings are appropriate. It is not appropriate for a judge to go and discuss a pending case with 2 justices when there's no invitation to do so. And Mlambo, you know, gave rulings, you know, it basically allowed the state capture inquiry to proceed by finding that the remedial action of the public protector, because of the issues of conflict with Jacob Zuma, was appropriate, you know, endorsed what she did. And you know, we see it again and again. Acting Justice Daya Pillay called over the coals because she would be required in any criminal case if someone didn't arrive, was not prepared to accept a problematic medical note from Jacob Zuma and issued a suspended order for his arrest. And in a case which was never overturned, which the Concourt didn't choose to even hear an appeal on, and neither did the SCA, found against Jacob Zuma in the Derek Hanekom defamation case, and was hauled over the coals by Julius Malema for quoting an excerpt from an ANC conference. You are sending a message again and again and again to judges that if you want to rise within the context of this JSC, keep your head down, don't take on political cases, and don't, like Zondo, come up and say, you can't call us house Negroes. That is an insult. And I think that is one of the most disturbing aspects that's emerging again and again, and it urgently needs to be addressed. Because whether there's an agenda or not an agenda, there's a very concerted drive to tell judges that if they do make decisions against particular politically powerful individuals, that may be the beginning and the end of their careers, and that's not healthy for a democracy.
Very strong and sobering points from Karyn Maughan. Lawson, we have 5 minutes less now, 4. I want to quickly just address this point with you because it has been bothering me. I have been wondering about this. Isn't there also a discussion to be had about the constitutional limit on judges' terms in South Africa? If my understanding of the Constitution is correct, and I'm very much maybe wrong on this, but there's a 12-year limit to your time on the bench in the Constitutional Court. Now, we've seen relatively young judges like Dikgamo Seneke, Kate O'Regan, Edwin Cameron having to leave the bench because their time expired when they had still so much to give. And, that means we wouldn't have to be here every second year at JSC hearings that fizzle out or not. What is your take on that? Is that not something that we should reconsider?
Well, it's probably amongst the things that we need to reconsider. But, personally, I don't think that there's a fundamental problem with that. I think a term limit in principle is a very good idea, and that we should have that, and we should not go the American route of, serving for life. So, what is that term limit going to be? 12 years, 15 years? I don't think that necessarily solves anything. I think the 12-year term limit has worked well for us. Yes, certain judges have had to retire at an early age because of, they were appointed to the Concourt at an early age. But I think that churn of justices in the Constitutional Court is a good thing for the court, for the rule of law, for the independence of the judiciary. So I wouldn't necessarily want to tamper with that at this point in time. I think there are far more fundamental problems with the JSC that we need to focus on rather than term limits for Concourt judges.
Nicole, if I can just ask you to respond to the same matter in a minute.
I agree with Lawson. I mean, there may be something to be looked at there, but for me, it's neither here nor there. And I think kind of renewal of our bench is a good thing. I don't think that we lack merit and skill and expertise, and in fact, it's a process whereby we renew our judicial and legal system, and that's for the good. I do think, and understandably, we've kind of fetishized the initial benches of the Constitutional Court. They were, it was composed of some really extraordinary jurists, and as a country, we were incredibly fortunate to have them sit and serve as they did. But I think in the long term, as a kind of maturing democracy, that we have justices who, might not occupy the kind of public profile that first bench did, but, studiously, rigorously hand down our constitutional jurisprudence is what we want as a country, a solid, reliable, top highest court. And I think, as I said, having judges coming through, offering them their services for a limited period is all for the good.
On that high note, I'm going to call it quits. Thank you very much, Nicole Fritz, Lawson Naidoo, and Karyn Maughan for being my guests this afternoon in our lunchtime frontline on whether the judiciary is in crisis. I don't think it's an easy yes or no answer. There's still many things to happen. Please stay tuned to News 24 over the next couple of days, months, and years. We will bring you all the latest developments on this score and anything else to do with judges, judicial politics, the JSC, and the next Chief Justice. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, goodbye and take care.